salt marsh on the southern coast of Australia. Flat, bleak and desolate at first sight, but with a strange beauty all its own. As we go into it, we'll find the marsh and the surrounding country full of wildfowl and other birds, such as the migratory waders. Overlooked by most, it's one of my favourite spots. Throughout these marshes there are built-up banks and levees, some man-made and some natural, and these have become a haunt for the smaller birds, especially along the immediate littoral. Further back there are a lot of trees and scrub, but along this front part the reeds and the sedges and the docks and so forth are the only cover for these small birds. And it doesn't really require much of a search before you begin to find their nesting spots and their roosting places. This is the nest of the little grass bird, deep in the shelter of the herbage. Another small bird of the sedges is the reed warbler with its sweet, rich song. The 12-feathered nest is securely laced to the reed stems. The reed warbler is the nightingale of the marsh. Singing on summer nights, it keeps the marshes alive and beautiful all through the darkness. The growth along the edges of the pools not only provides cover, but also food for the small birds. The introduced Scotch thistle is one of the favourite foods of an introduced bird, the goldfinch. The seeds carry a parachute of fluff, which broadcasts them on the marsh wind. Also on the marsh wind, hunting low, flies the swamp harrier, a rather sinister bird, usually flying upwind, seeking its prey. Those slotted ends in the wing, almost like fingers, work like the handily paid slots in an aeroplane's wing, and are for exactly the same purpose, to control the airflow over the bird's wings as it manoeuvres, and also to prevent it stalling at slow speeds. Swamp harriers feed on all kinds of small mammals, even nestling birds or anything else they can snatch up. Back it goes to its nest, hidden deep in the sedges. Not all life on the marshes. This is a sad but quite common sight at the end of every nesting season. It's a young dead swan, probably about 2 or 3 months old. I don't know what killed it. It's very hard to say. A lot of them die naturally. May have been shot by a passing shooter, but out here it's not so likely. But this tremendous mortality is just something that is part of the natural scene and has to happen every year. There must be perhaps 90% of all the young birds and animals that are born must die to keep the population more or less level. Beyond the marsh, beyond the beach, is the sea. And on the sea, a sight which always to me is a little strange. Black swans feeding in the shallows. See them hooping and looping their necks down to pick up the sea lettuce, that common, rather lettuce-like weed that so frequently is washed up on our beaches. One of my main reasons, of course, for being out in such places is to draw the birds and their animals, a continuing task of turning nature into art, selecting form from confusion. But sometimes, as you can see, the order is already there. I'm sitting in what's known in the bird-watching world as a hide, or what the Americans call a blind. It's a rather frightening apparition sitting up in this flat landscape, but strangely enough, the birds don't seem to mind it. We build these to conceal ourselves, obviously, and the size of the thing and the shape of it doesn't seem to worry the birds at all. It's just a matter of getting the human shape out of sight. Sounds disturb them rather, but this thing of being concealed works terribly well. Without it, you can't approach these wild marsh birds. They're just so wild that you couldn't get within a quarter of a mile of most of them. But sitting in here, I can sit here with my binoculars and sketchbook, and sometimes the birds are within feet of me, which is a very satisfactory and comfortable way of bird watching. All of these birds that we've just been watching are waders. This is a typical one, the sharp-tailed sandpiper. A very diverse group of birds, but they have a number of things in common. Most noticeably, their long bill for probing in the mud and their long legs for wading in the water. Many of them, like this one, are migratory, undertaking the incredible journey from Siberia and Alaska and such places to our shores every year, and then returning north again to nest. Here's a collection, sharp-tailed sandpipers, and a red-necked stint bobbing along there in the front. Here's a one-legged gull preening on the bank. There's a little stint going across there, also one-legged. And a sharp-tail in the middle with one leg too. It's amazing how many one-legged birds there are. Probably the fish bite them off when they're swimming out at sea. The interesting thing about these sharp-tails is their nesting grounds were discovered only a few years ago, even though they come down here in their millions. And here's the giant of the marsh, the white-faced heron, commonly but quite erroneously known as the blue crane. Here's a most remarkable bird. It's grotesque and beautiful at the same time. The white-headed stilt. Candy pink legs, glossy black back. These birds nest in scattered colonies or singly throughout the marshes. More sharp-tails. And here's the avocet, another very long-legged wader. It's interesting to realize that although all these birds are waders, they would have very different ecological niches. Some with such long legs wading in the deep waters, and the smaller birds feeding in the shallows. You see that avocet's bill, the strange upturned curve, and then right at the very tip it curves down again, and it's developed this bill, and with it developed a very precise and specific feeding habit of sweeping its bill sideways through the water. Very beautiful in flight. To me, the leitmotif of the marshes, of course, is the wind, always soughing and howling and sighing through the reeds and the sedges across the water. And the birds shelter from the wind quite frequently, even the hardy migrants, and the tough old ravens tucked down in behind the grass growing along the edge of the track. The gulls too come in to preen out their feathers between the tides when they're not feeding on the salt flats. More curlew sandpipers and sharp-tailed sandpipers. A quick snipe-like flight they have, don't they? Butterflies too, sheltering down out of the wind in amongst the nettles and the docks. They couldn't live here if it weren't for the cover. Immediately behind the littoral, behind these sea swamps, building up a dense shelter from the wind is a row of Melaleuca scrub, and has created a whole new world out of the wind, out of the elements, a cushioned, secluded, almost grave-like quality inside there. And yet again we have this contrast between the life and the death. We have this deep, dense forest absolutely crammed with small birds and creatures. There are goldfinches, silver eyes nesting, and the whole world just a few steps away from this open marshland. Let's take those steps. First thing we find is a very hairy caterpillar. Quite a monster, isn't he, close up? That hairiness is a great protection from birds. Very, very few birds in Australia will eat a hairy caterpillar. Here's a silver eyes nest with its 3 eggs tucked away in the shelter of the undergrowth. And looking out over the top, the rough stick nest of a raven. Sentinel of the bush. And here's a goldfinch's nest, still empty yet, just finished off by the look of it. Another silver eyes nest. The young birds just hatched out, hours old, feebly waving their heads. Here is a silver eye on the nest, a small warbler-like bird. She's sitting there bravely in spite of our intrusion. She's built a nest low down in a thick Melaleuca right in the heart of this scrub, probably safe from all predation except perhaps our human one. It's one of the common birds in this thicket, a very brave and gallant little creature. Here comes the other parent bird to take over its duties. A little bit quicker about settling down than the first one. Possibly the female. Very snug, isn't it, the way they fit into that cradle. Beyond the wood is the wider scene of the open marsh and the wilder bird, the wild fowl of Australia, the ducks and the swans that live by flight and speed rather than by stealth and hiding. See those teals sweeping across the grass tops. The vertical, threatening figure of man appears on the flat landscape. And for these birds that have nowhere to hide, explosion into flight is the only escape. The swans belt their way across the water, pattering at it with their feet. Really hard work getting that great body into the air, isn't it? There goes a coot. Startled up his little home creek. Four beating black and white wings. A beautiful, powerful bird, the swan, and yet it seems to have quite an amount of trouble flying. That long, sinuous neck works hard at propelling the bird. Every muscle is working. But of course, during the nesting season, when they have cygnets like this, they can't flee. They have to stay and protect their downy youngsters. Now here's a female teal fluttering and slapping away across the water, pretending she's wounded to take my attention from the ducklings that are floating somewhere close by. Here's one, quite a young one, perhaps only a week old. The teal and the black duck storm across the sky. You can pick out the teal by their more rapid wing beat. Another interesting little bird of the marsh, the pink-eared duck, very well named the zebra duck by the shooters. Grey teal, good look at them, coming in slowly over their own reflections and dropping onto the mirrored water. We'll just go down the marshy bottom here and see what we can put up. You never know what you'll find in a corner like this. Here we are, some white ibis. Very similar to Egypt's sacred ibis. If we get a bit closer, we'll put them to flight and have a good look at them. There they go. Stunning bird. Pure white except for a few black plumes on the back and a great black sickle bill coming out of a bare, skin, leathery head. A very fine bird. Our sacred ibis of the marsh. Here's the white-faced heron again, dropping in on broad parachute wings. Little graceful altercation over the perching post. Really are delightful birds. Lovely dove grey colour, most of their plumage, with a soft russet on the front. Another broad-winged, powerful flyer of the marsh. Here's a familiar animal, all too familiar. Like everywhere else, it's something of a scourge here on the marshes. But myxomatosis has been introduced. And I frequently find their tattered little bodies lying in the paths and under the low bushes. And here's a raven doing his job of cleaning up. He's a much maligned bird, the old raven. I'm quite fond of them. I think obviously they're very useful, but there's something very attractive and bold about them as well. Another bold bird, but less attractive. Great nuisance to the bird watcher, the spur-winged plover. Always shrieking and yelling and giving away your position where you're hiding in the bushes. We can just put this great wader on. We'll go off and do something a bit more vigorous and find that there's a lot more to bird watching than sitting on your backside in the hide waiting for them to come to you. Here, where the water runs deeper, it has drowned the trees, leaving a gaunt, flooded forest. Deep in the middle of this skeleton forest, the straw-necked ibis nest. There's a graceful row of them. It always seems weird to see such large birds perched in a tree, but they seem to manage quite well. They only have partially webbed toes, so I suppose they can curl the lower part of their foot around the bough quite successfully. And here are the young ones in the nest. Rather ugly, scruffy little things, aren't they? Covered in grey down. Here's one panting in the heat, a bit miserable. They nest on little islands that have been left all around the boles of the trees. Hard to imagine such an ugly thing growing into the beautiful sickle-billed ibis, isn't it? Here you see on this one the flight feathers just growing out of the wing, still encased in their sheath for quill. They don't seem to mind being handled much. Look a little astonished, if anything. Like the waders, these birds feed in the mud, probing down into the softness with these great bills and wading, sometimes quite up to their bodies in the muddy water. Here's a young chick, only a day old, I would say. As you can see, it's not much larger than the egg from which it hatched. Top one there having a bit of trouble getting its food down its long gullet. Now this is the edge of the other part of the colony, a different species of bird. The yellow-faced cormorant. Like many of our cormorants, it doesn't nest along the coastline necessarily, but on inland marshes and waterways of all kinds. Snake-necked, strangely sinuous, and a mixture of ugly and beautiful in lots of ways. Very unpopular with the fishermen, being a more expert fisher than most men. One of the chief attractions for me, of course, in a place like this is the ready availability of subject matters for paintings. It's essential to keep coming back to situations like this for collecting reference and looking at birds and becoming more familiar with their shapes and their habits. But there's no end to it, really. I'll still be out here when I'm a doddering old man of 100, staggering about in the marshes with my little sketch pad. As a bird artist, I, of course, have to spend many hours in a hide. One builds them in all sorts of situations and spends a great deal of one's life crouched inside that little hessian box. In fact, one develops a kind of love-hate relationship. Sometimes it's incredibly rewarding and the birds flock in around you and you sit there thrilled to be surrounded by so much life. At other times, the hours drag and the scene looks like this. Not a bird in sight. One, in fact, becomes incredibly bored, wondering what it's all about. After some of these long sojourns, without seeing a single thing, you eventually give in. Driven by desperation to see a bit of activity, you come out and have a look around. If the birds won't make the activity for me, I make it for them.